Long before humans claimed their place among the stars, there was another race that everyone in the galaxy feared. They were not just powerful, they were considered untouchable. They were known as the Vedran, and their name carried the weight of terror. For thousands of years, they ruled entire star systems with an iron hand. Their fleets crossed the void like shadows, swallowing weaker species without mercy. Whenever a new civilization rose, the Vedran arrived first to remind them of their place. They were not seen as rulers but as predators, the kind of predators that sat at the very top of the food chain. The smaller races whispered about them in hushed tones. Some called them gods, others called them demons, but everyone agreed on one thing: the Vedran were the apex. For them, the galaxy was their hunting ground, and no one could challenge their throne. They believed this truth as deeply as they believed in their own blood. No one dared resist. The Vedran had technology that was centuries ahead of others. Their weapons could shatter planets. Their ships were living nightmares, vast engines of destruction that glowed like fire in the dark. They carried themselves with pride, with arrogance, with the certainty that they were born to rule forever. To the Vedran, the universe was theirs to shape, and the other species were nothing more than tools, slaves, or prey. They crushed rebellions without hesitation. They erased entire species that showed even the smallest hint of defiance. In their minds, they were eternal. They were destiny. For generations, the galaxy lived under their shadow. But shadows never last forever. The story begins not with their rise but with their fall. Today, no Vedran walks the stars. Their empire, once so feared, is gone. Their ships lie as ruins in forgotten graveyards of space. Their names are carved only in old records, half-broken and fading. To many, they are nothing more than legends, ghost stories told by wandering traders, myths carried by the stars. Yet the truth is darker, far more terrifying. The apex did not fade by themselves. They were not destroyed by time or by weakness. They were erased. Something rose against them. Something that no one expected, something that no one believed could ever stand a chance. That something was humanity. But before humanity's story begins, the legend of the apex must be told. The Vedran were a race of strength and cruelty, tall and broad, with scales that shimmered like iron and eyes that burned like cold fire. They thrived in war. They saw violence not as a tool but as art. For them, dominance was the natural order. The galaxy was divided into two kinds of beings, hunters and hunted. And in their eyes, there was only one true hunter. When the Vedran entered a star system, silence followed. Civilizations surrendered before the first shot was fired. To resist was suicide. They gave offerings of resources, technology, and even their own people to avoid the wrath of the apex. Generations grew under fear, teaching their children that survival meant obedience. Stories spread of planets turned to ash for refusing tribute. Whole species vanished overnight, erased without a trace. The message was clear: challenge the apex, and you will not live to regret it. This fear, this terror, was the foundation of the Vedran Empire. And for a long time, it worked. But arrogance is a slow poison. The Vedran believed themselves immortal. They thought no force in the universe could rise against them. They had faced rebellions, yes, but they crushed them with such ease that the thought of defeat became laughable. They saw themselves not as rulers but as the rightful masters of existence. Other races were beneath them, incapable of anything beyond servitude. Their mistake was simple but fatal. They believed fear would last forever. Yet fear fades, and in the silence of that fear, something else grows: hope. Somewhere, far away from their empire's heart, in a quiet corner of the stars, a new species began to rise. They were not strong like the apex, not tall, not armored, not born for war. They were fragile compared to the giants that ruled the galaxy. Their ships were small, their weapons primitive, and their worlds young. To the apex, they were nothing. But history does not bend to arrogance. It bends to will. And these fragile beings, these humans, carried a will that would one day break the unbreakable. Still, the galaxy did not know this yet. All they knew was the shadow of the apex, and that shadow was long. Imagine a child born on a small world, never knowing freedom, never knowing safety, only fear of the Vedran. That was life across the stars. Whole generations grew up believing the apex were eternal. Even the oldest races, ones that had seen empires rise and fall, believed the apex could never be defeated. But legends always hide a truth, and the truth is this: the stronger the empire, the harder it falls. And when it falls, the sound shakes the entire galaxy. The Vedran believed they had no equal. They believed they were forever. But forever is a lie, and their story, like all stories, was racing toward an end. The galaxy remembers them as predators, but history remembers them as prey. This is not their story of glory. This is their story of extinction. And it begins with one name, whispered across the stars with both awe and fear: humanity. Long before their fall, the Vedran were not just another species in the galaxy. They were the storm that swept across stars and turned the unknown into their empire. Their rise began in silence, on a world of harsh deserts and endless skies. Their home planet was unforgiving, a place where only the strongest survived, and in that crucible, the Vedran were forged. They learned to fight before they learned to build. They hunted predators larger than themselves, fought against storms that tore mountains apart, and lived in a constant struggle against nature itself. In this struggle, they found strength. In this endless fight for survival, they learned one lesson that would carry them across the galaxy: only the strongest deserve to live. When they discovered the stars, their destiny changed forever. At first, they were explorers, curious about the worlds beyond their sky. But exploration soon became conquest. Each planet they reached was measured not by its beauty but by its value. Was it rich in resources? Was it strong enough to resist? If the answer was no, the planet became theirs. If the answer was yes, then the Vedran destroyed it to prove no resistance could stand against them. Their technology advanced quickly, not because they loved science but because they loved war. Every invention, every machine, every discovery was turned into a weapon. Their ships were not crafted to carry explorers but to carry soldiers. Their cities were not built for comfort but for war factories. They thrived on dominance, and soon their fleets grew into storms that no star system could ignore. When the Vedran appeared, they did not ask for peace. They did not ask for trade. They came with demands, and when those demands were refused, they came with fire. Entire civilizations surrendered without a fight, knowing that resistance meant death. And those who resisted learned the true cost of defiance. The Vedran did not simply conquer, they erased. Planets burned, skies turned black with smoke, and billions vanished in moments. For them, this was not cruelty. For them, this was natural law. They believed the galaxy belonged to hunters, and they alone were the true hunters. Their empire grew faster than any before it. Star by star, system by system, they expanded their reach. Other species learned quickly that it was better to bow than to bleed. Tribute was offered, resources, technology, even slaves, to keep the apex satisfied. Fear became the currency of their rule, and it worked. No one dared to challenge them. No one even dreamed of it. Their rise seemed unstoppable, and their arrogance grew with every victory. They began to see themselves as eternal. They called themselves the apex species, not as a title given by others but as a truth written into the stars. They looked down on the rest of the galaxy, seeing only weakness, inferiority, and prey. And yet, even in their arrogance, they were admired. Many alien historians, long after their fall, would admit that the Vedran were unmatched in their brilliance for war. Their fleets were terrifying machines of precision. Their soldiers were disciplined and merciless. Their leaders were cunning, able to turn defeat into victory through sheer will. They believed in unity through fear, and for a time, it worked perfectly. Every conquered world added to their power, every victory fed their pride. They thought themselves untouchable. To them, rebellions were entertainment, nothing more than a chance to display their power once again. A small uprising here, a desperate defense there, all crushed within days. Each defeat for their enemies was another reminder that the apex could not be stopped. They became legends even while alive, their shadow covering the galaxy like a permanent eclipse. And yet, in that shadow, seeds of hate and resistance grew quietly. The Vaedran did not notice. They believed fear would last forever. They believed no species would ever dare rise against them. After all, what was the point? No one had ever won against them. No one had ever even survived long enough to tell a different story. The Vaedran were masters of war, born from a world of suffering and sharpened by centuries of conquest. But they made one mistake, a mistake that would one day end them. They believed strength was the only measure of power. They thought technology and muscle were everything. They forgot the power of patience, of unity, of adaptability. They forgot that even the strongest predator can fall if the prey learns how to fight back. For now, though, the galaxy trembled beneath them. Their rise was complete, their empire vast, and their dominance unquestioned. They were kings, hunters, conquerors, and destroyers. They were the apex species, and in their eyes, the galaxy had no equal. They did not know it then, but far away, on a small blue world circling a yellow sun, a new kind of rival was beginning to dream of the stars. That rival was fragile, untested, and still crawling out of its own history of wars and struggles. But in time, that fragile species would become the storm the Vaedran never saw coming. In time, humans would challenge the eternal. But for now, the apex rose higher and higher, blind to the fall that waited for them in the dark. Far away from the burning stars of the Vaedran Empire, in a quiet corner of the galaxy, a small blue world spun around an ordinary yellow sun. On this world lived a species that no one knew, a species that had fought countless wars against itself, survived plagues, disasters, and endless struggles, a species that never gave up no matter how hard life pressed against it. These were humans. At first, they were nothing compared to the giants of the galaxy. They had no fleets that stretched across the stars, no weapons that could shatter planets, no empires carved from fear. They were fragile, soft-skinned, small in numbers compared to others, and bound to their world for most of their early history. But humans had something else, something that no other species valued as much: the will to survive and the hunger to grow. On their own world, they had faced predators larger and stronger, yet they learned to fight with tools, to outthink their enemies, to turn weakness into strength. When their own kind waged wars against each other, they learned strategy, discipline, and the terrible cost of conflict. By the time they reached the stars, they were not the strongest, but they were prepared in ways no one could see. Humanity's first steps into space were humble. Small ships, fragile colonies, stations orbiting nearby worlds. To the Vaedran, who watched from the shadows, these new arrivals were laughable. A weak species daring to enter the stars? To the apex, it was amusing. They did not see a rival, only prey stretching its neck too far. But what the Vaedran failed to understand was that humans did not see themselves as weak. Every failure was a lesson, every loss a chance to adapt. When their ships failed, they built better ones. When their colonies suffered, they rebuilt stronger. Unlike the apex, who had grown arrogant in their eternal power, humans lived with the memory of struggle written in their very bones. They did not fear difficulty, they embraced it. Soon, humans began to spread further. New colonies rose on barren moons, distant planets, and strange alien worlds. They carried their determination with them, planting their flags where no one else dared to go. They made mistakes, yes, but they learned faster than anyone. And as they grew, whispers spread across the galaxy. Other species, long crushed beneath the shadow of the apex, began to notice humanity. At first, they laughed. How could such a fragile species survive in the galaxy ruled by predators? But then they watched closer. They saw humans fight not just enemies but nature itself. They saw humans adapt to deadly worlds that should have killed them. They saw humans form alliances, share knowledge, and keep pushing forward no matter how heavy the odds. Curiosity replaced laughter, and then curiosity turned into fear. For the first time in centuries, something new had entered the game of the stars. The apex were not afraid. They had no reason to be. They had crushed every rival that ever dared to stand against them. To them, humanity was nothing more than an insect crawling on the edge of the galaxy. But even an insect can bite, and when it bites, it can bring down the mighty. Humanity's first contact with the Vedran did not happen with peace. It happened with blood. A small human colony, newly built, stood in a system the Vedran claimed as their own. The humans did not know the Apex had eyes on that world, or maybe they did and refused to care. To the humans, it was another chance to prove they belonged among the stars. To the Vedran, it was an insult, a challenge to their eternal dominance. They sent ships, vast warships that dwarfed the small human fleet. They expected the humans to kneel, to surrender, to beg for mercy. That was how it always happened. But this time, something different occurred. The humans fought back. Outnumbered, outgunned, hopeless against such power, the humans did not surrender. They launched every weapon, fired every shot, and fought with a fury the Apex had never seen. Their colony burned, their ships shattered, but their spirit did not break. Even when defeat was certain, they refused to bow. For the first time, the Vedran faced an enemy that would rather die than kneel. It shocked them. It confused them. And in that confusion, a seed was planted, a seed of doubt. The humans lost that first battle, yes, but the story did not end there. Survivors spread the tale, and the galaxy listened. Whispers grew louder. Who were these humans that dared to stand against the Apex? Who were these fragile beings that resisted where countless others had bowed? The answer was simple. They were a species that had never known peace, a species that had been forged in war and suffering long before they reached the stars. And now, they carried that spirit into the galaxy. The Vedran laughed it off at first, dismissing humans as foolish, stubborn creatures. But in the shadows of their empire, something dangerous was beginning. Humans were not afraid of them. They studied their enemies, learned their weaknesses, and prepared for the next encounter. And when the next battle came, the Apex would learn a truth they had never faced before. Humans might lose battles, but they would not lose the war. For humanity had arrived, and their arrival would change the galaxy forever. The first true clash between humanity and the Vedran began not with words but with fire. After the destruction of the first colony, humans knew the Apex would not tolerate their presence in the galaxy. They understood that this was not a misunderstanding or an accident. It was a message, a warning from the so-called rulers of the stars. But humans were not a species that lived by fear. They were a species that turned warnings into challenges. Across human worlds and stations, the news spread like wildfire. The Apex had attacked, the Apex had killed, the Apex had shown their power. Yet, instead of breaking, humanity hardened. They had lost colonies before, they had lost cities, they had lost millions in their own wars back on Earth, and every time they had risen again stronger than before. Now they faced an enemy unlike any in their history, but they carried with them the same unshakable will. They would not surrender. They would not kneel. The Vedran, in their arrogance, saw this as amusing. To them, humans were insects that refused to die quickly. They decided to make an example, to crush humanity so completely that no other species would ever dare think of resistance again. They sent a fleet, larger and deadlier than anything humans had ever seen, against a human colony known as Ardent Reach. The Vedran expected fear, begging, surrender. What they found was defiance. When the fleet appeared, the humans did not run. Their defenses were weak compared to the Apex, their ships small and fragile, their weapons primitive by galactic standards, but they fought with everything they had. They launched old missiles, fired railguns that shook their ships apart, and filled the void with fire. They fought with desperation, with fury, with a will that ignored the hopelessness of the battle. The Vedran laughed at first, mocking the humans for their bravery, calling it foolishness. But then something strange happened. The humans refused to die quietly. Even as their ships burned, they rammed enemy cruisers, detonated reactors, and dragged Apex warships into death with them. A single human frigate, broken and aflame, turned itself into a weapon and slammed into a Vedran destroyer, tearing it apart in a blaze that lit the system. This shocked the Apex. They were used to enemies running, crying, begging for mercy, not turning their own deaths into weapons. For the first time in centuries, they felt something they had forgotten: resistance. The battle raged for hours. Humans lost more ships, more lives, but every loss carried a price for the Apex. By the end of the clash, the colony lay in ruins, the human fleet shattered, but the Vedran had lost ships too, and more importantly, they had lost the illusion of their untouchable power. Stories spread quickly, carried by survivors and by hidden witnesses. Whispers reached other alien species. The humans had faced the Apex and struck back. They had lost, yes, but they had wounded the unbeatable. For many species, this was unthinkable. For the Vedran, it was an insult that burned deep. They could not allow this to stand. They swore humanity would be crushed, their worlds burned, their name erased. But even as they planned vengeance, humans prepared in their own way. They studied the battle, examined every detail, every weakness they had seen in the Apex war machine. They did not see defeat, they saw lessons. They asked not, how do we survive, but, how do we win next time? That was the difference, the thing the Apex could not understand. To them, victory was a birthright, something they never had to fight for. To humans, victory was earned, built from blood, sacrifice, and endless struggle. Even in loss, humans grew stronger. And that first clash, though it seemed small in the grand scale of galactic war, was the spark that lit a fire no one could put out. Across the galaxy, in hidden corners and oppressed worlds, species who had bowed to the Apex began to whisper. If humans could fight back, maybe they could too. If humans could wound the giants, maybe the giants could bleed. The Vedran did not see it yet, but the seeds of their downfall had been planted in that battle. Ardent Reach became more than a colony, it became a symbol. For humans, it was a reminder that they could stand even against the strongest. For the Apex, it was the first crack in their empire's armor. And cracks, once formed, only grow. The Vedran would come again, stronger, angrier, determined to erase humanity from existence. But what they did not know was that humans were ready. They had tasted the fire of the Apex, and they were not afraid. They had been forged in struggle since the beginning of their history, and now, facing the so-called apex of the galaxy, they would prove that sometimes the prey can become the predator. The first clash was over, but the war was only beginning. The Vedran believed power was strength of body, size of fleets, and fire of weapons, but humans saw power in another way. To them, strength was not only in muscles or in the weight of metal but in the mind, in the ability to learn, to adapt, to change faster than any enemy could. After the first clashes, humanity understood a hard truth. They could not win against the Apex in direct battle, not yet. The Vedran had more ships, more soldiers, more weapons that could destroy entire cities in seconds. Fighting them head-on was suicide. But humans were not strangers to fighting stronger enemies. Their entire history was filled with battles where they were the weaker side, yet they had survived through cunning, through creativity, through refusing to fight on the enemy's terms. Now they carried that history into the stars. On every human world, scientists, engineers, and strategists gathered to study the Apex. They broke down every encounter, every wreck of enemy ships, every movement of their fleets. They asked questions others were too afraid to ask. Where are their weak points? Where are their blind spots? What do they ignore because of arrogance? And slowly, answers began to appear. The Vedran fleets were vast but predictable. Their power was terrifying but heavy, built on old traditions and patterns they never questioned. They always attacked with overwhelming force, but that force moved like a blunt hammer, not a precise blade. Humans realized that if they could not fight strength with strength, they would fight with speed, with traps, with patience. They began to design ships not to match the Apex in power, but to outmaneuver them. Smaller, faster vessels that could strike and vanish. Weapons that targeted weak points instead of wasting fire against impenetrable armor. They built electronic tools to confuse Vedran sensors, to make shadows in space, to turn battles into chaos. Where the apex expected submission, humans gave them deception. Where the apex expected fear, humans gave them defiance. And as humans prepared, they remembered another lesson from their history. Knowledge itself is a weapon. Spies were sent into the dark, hidden probes followed Vedran fleets, and information became the sharpest blade. The Vedran never thought much of information, they trusted their size and firepower too much. But humans knew wars were won not by who had the largest army but by who understood the battlefield better. And so, step by step, humanity gathered knowledge, and with knowledge came power. When the next battles came, the difference was clear. A Vedran fleet entered a system, confident as always, expecting quick victory. But this time the humans were ready. Mines floated in hidden belts of asteroids, traps waited in silence, and human ships appeared only long enough to strike before vanishing into the void. Confusion spread among the apex. They fired their massive cannons but hit nothing but empty space. They pursued fleeing ships only to find themselves ambushed. They tried to crush their enemies as always, but the enemy was no longer where they expected. For the first time, the apex felt frustration. Their strength was being mocked, their pride wounded by a species they had once dismissed as insects. To humans, each of these battles was not just survival but practice. Win or lose, they learned. Every move the Vedran made was studied, every weakness noted, every strength countered. Slowly, humanity built a playbook against the predators of the stars. They did not grow stronger by accident but by design. And more than that, they used something no other species dared to use against the apex: imagination. While the Vedran repeated the same methods that had worked for centuries, humans invented new ones with every encounter. Traps hidden in debris fields. Decoy ships that exploded in the middle of enemy formations. Electronic signals that created fake fleets, leading the apex into ambushes. Small victories began to appear, victories so small the Vedran at first ignored them, but they added up, and soon the cracks in the great empire grew wider. The galaxy noticed. Other species, long crushed, began to watch more closely. Whispers spread of human cunning, of human defiance, of humans who could turn weakness into strength. Hope stirred where none had existed for generations. The apex did not fear yet, but they began to grow angry. They had believed themselves eternal, unchallengeable, yet these small creatures dared to wound them, dared to trick them, dared to laugh in the face of their power. In their arrogance, they vowed to destroy humanity completely, to burn every human world until nothing was left. But the more they raged, the more mistakes they made, and the more humanity learned. This was the power of the human mind. It was not strength of body or wealth of fleets. It was the ability to adapt faster than anyone else. And in that, humans were unmatched. Every battle that should have ended in total defeat instead became a lesson, and every lesson made them stronger. The Vedran could not see it, but the war they thought they were winning was already slipping from their hands. The humans were not only fighting back, they were evolving. The predators of the galaxy had met prey that refused to be eaten, prey that learned to fight back with teeth and fire. And soon, that prey would become the new predator. The mind of humanity had awakened against the apex, and nothing would stop it. The war that began as a hopeless struggle slowly changed its shape, and little by little, the galaxy saw something no one had imagined before. The mighty apex were being pushed back. At first, it was only whispers, stories carried by traders and smugglers, reports that human fleets had survived encounters where none should have lived, rumors of apex warships destroyed by a species too young to stand against them. The Vedran ignored the whispers, calling them lies, calling them tricks, but the truth was undeniable. Humanity was turning the tide. Every clash brought new lessons, and every lesson became a weapon. Human fleets stopped meeting the apex head-on. Instead, they fought on their own terms. They struck from the shadows, retreated when the enemy grew too strong, and returned with plans that cut deeper each time. Their fleets grew faster, their weapons sharper, and their courage stronger. They learned to fight in asteroid belts, in nebulae, in the burning skies of dying stars. They turned the galaxy itself into a battlefield, one where the apex could not use their size to dominate. Slowly, victories began to appear, small at first but growing larger. A convoy of apex ships ambushed and destroyed. A fortress world of the Vedran besieged until it fell. A fleet once feared for centuries shattered in a storm of human fire. The galaxy watched in silence and awe, for no one had ever seen such a thing. The Apex were not supposed to lose. Yet here they were, bleeding. Humanity's will spread like fire. Colonies that had once lived in fear now held their heads high. Soldiers fought not only for survival but for victory. Every win inspired the next, every act of defiance gave birth to another. And beyond humanity, other species began to stir. They had lived too long under the shadow of the apex, too long with the weight of fear crushing their worlds. Now they saw humans, fragile humans, doing what no one had dared. If humanity could fight, why couldn't they? Secret messages passed between leaders of broken worlds. Hidden ships carried supplies to human fleets. Rebellions whispered in the dark, waiting for the moment to rise. The Apex felt the change too. Their pride would not let them admit it, but cracks were appearing in their empire. They sent larger fleets, greater armies, weapons that could burn entire planets, but the harder they struck, the more they lost. Their power was built on fear, and fear was fading. Where once their name silenced whole worlds, now it sparked anger, resistance, and hope. Humanity had shown the galaxy that the Apex could bleed, and once predators are seen bleeding, they are no longer untouchable. Still, the war was not easy. Humans paid in blood for every victory. Colonies burned, soldiers died, fleets were torn apart, but unlike others, humans did not break. Every loss only fueled their fire. They carried the memories of their dead as banners of defiance. Where the Apex thought destruction would shatter them, it only united them more. They became not just fighters but symbols, living proof that no empire is eternal. And in this proof, the tide truly turned. A great battle came in the Ternes system, where a massive Apex fleet descended to crush a human outpost. They expected another easy slaughter. Instead, they walked into a trap woven with patience and cunning. Human fleets emerged from the shadows of gas giants, hidden mines detonated across their path, and electronic warfare blinded their sensors. The Apex fought with fury, but for the first time in memory, they were surrounded. And when the dust cleared, it was the humans who stood victorious. The Ternes system became a legend, the moment when the galaxy believed the impossible was possible. Hope spread faster than fire. Rebellions erupted across Vedran-controlled worlds. Species that had bowed for centuries rose in defiance. Some fought with humans, others fought on their own, but all drew strength from the same truth. The Apex were not gods, they were not eternal, they were only mortal, and mortals could fall. Humanity had become more than a species, they had become a storm, and the storm was sweeping the galaxy. The Vedran raged at the insult. They could not accept the idea that prey had become predators, that weakness had turned into power. They swore vengeance, they promised annihilation, but deep inside, doubt began to grow. They had faced rebellions before, but never like this. This was not just resistance. This was war, and it was a war they were no longer sure they could win. The turning of the tide was not marked by a single victory, but by the endless will of a species that refused to die. Humanity had changed the game. They did not seek survival anymore, they sought triumph. And with every passing day, every battle won, and every world freed, the fall of the Apex drew closer. The galaxy had changed beyond recognition, and the once unshakable empire of the Vedran Apex now stood on the edge of collapse. For centuries they had ruled without challenge, crushing every spark of rebellion before it could grow. But now the sparks had become a firestorm, and the firestorm was out of their control. Humanity had given the galaxy more than victories, they had given it belief. Worlds that had been silent for ages rose in defiance, fleets that had once served as slaves turned their weapons against their masters, and species that had never dared whisper resistance now screamed for freedom. The Vedran fought back with all the fury of an empire desperate to survive. They unleashed war fleets larger than entire nations, weapons that could burn planets into dust, and armies bred for destruction, but none of it was enough. For every world they destroyed, two more rose against them. For every fleet they sent, humans and their allies found ways to break it. The Apex were still powerful, but their greatest weapon had always been fear, and that fear was gone. Without it, their enemies grew bolder, stronger, unstoppable. Humanity stood at the heart of it all. What had begun as a single desperate fight for survival had grown into a crusade to end the tyranny of the galaxy's so-called masters. Human admirals, once mocked for their crude tactics, now outsmarted Apex commanders with brilliant strategies. Human fleets, once fragile and weak, now carried weapons built from hard lessons and endless sacrifice. They were not the strongest or the oldest, but they were relentless, and their allies rallied around that relentlessness like a shield. The great turning point came at the siege of Kalar Prime, the capital of the Vedran Empire, a world that had never been touched by war in thousands of years. It was a planet of legends, the throne of the Apex, the place from which their rule had stretched across the stars. The idea that anyone could threaten it was unthinkable, yet humanity and their allies stood in its skies, ready to finish what they had begun. The Apex gathered every fleet they still controlled, every weapon they could muster, for this was the final stand. The battle that followed was like nothing the galaxy had ever seen. Stars themselves seemed to tremble as fleets clashed in fire and steel. Thousands of ships burned, worlds nearby shook under the fury of weapons beyond imagination, and the very sky was torn apart by war. The Apex fought with desperation, and for a moment it seemed their fury might turn the tide. Human fleets suffered, allies faltered, and whole armadas were lost in the firestorm. But humanity had never fought for easy victories. They fought with the same stubborn will that had carried them since the first clash, the same defiance that had turned every loss into strength. They refused to break, and in their refusal, they found the opening they needed. Human ships broke through the lines, tearing into the heart of the Apex fleet. Allied forces struck in unison, species long enslaved now bringing vengeance upon their former masters. One by one the Apex warships fell, their pride shattering with each defeat. The skies of Kalar Prime burned, and for the first time in their long history, the Vedran Apex faced the truth. They were no longer the rulers of the stars. They were prey, and the prey they had mocked had become predators. On the surface of Kalar Prime, the war raged as well. Human soldiers and their allies fought through towering cities and ancient halls where the Apex had once celebrated their endless rule. The streets echoed not with the voices of rulers but with the roar of battle and the cry for freedom. Every step forward was drenched in blood, but the march did not stop. At last the throne itself was reached, the great chamber where the Apex High Council had ruled for ages. It was no longer a place of command, it was a place of desperation. The rulers who had once looked down on the galaxy with arrogance now trembled as the armies of humanity and their allies stood before them. Some screamed for mercy, others for vengeance, but none of it mattered. Their reign was over. The council was shattered, their power broken, and the empire that had once been eternal lay in ruins. Across the galaxy, the fall of Kalar Prime echoed like thunder. The species who had once feared the Apex now celebrated their freedom. Chains were broken, banners of rebellion rose high, and for the first time in living memory, the galaxy was free of the shadow that had loomed over it for centuries. Humanity stood at the center of it all, not as conquerors but as survivors who had refused to bow. They had faced the so-called strongest, the self-proclaimed rulers of existence, and they had proven that no empire, no matter how mighty, could stand against the will of those who refused to die. The fall of the Apex was more than the end of a war, it was the end of an age. The galaxy would never be the same again. Worlds would rebuild, species would find their voices, and new paths would be forged from the ashes of tyranny. Humanity had not only secured its survival, it had reshaped the destiny of countless stars. And as the ruins of Kalar Prime smoldered and the last cries of the Apex faded into silence, one truth remained clear. Those who had once been considered prey had risen to become something greater, something unstoppable, and in their rise, they had shown that no predator rules forever. The fall of the Apex was not the end of the story but the beginning of a new and uncertain dawn. Across the galaxy, worlds that had lived for centuries in fear now stood free, but freedom came with questions and chaos. Who would lead? Who would rebuild? Who would ensure that another empire of cruelty did not rise from the ashes? The destruction of the Vedran left a void, and in that void, the galaxy looked to humanity. At first many could not believe it. How could a species so young, so small compared to the ancient empires, now hold the attention of billions of stars? But the truth was undeniable. Humanity had done what no one else had dared. They had stood against the apex and prevailed, and in doing so, they had earned the trust and respect of allies who once doubted them. Human leaders gathered with representatives of newly freed species on neutral worlds, their meetings filled with both hope and fear. Some demanded vengeance, calling for the total extermination of every last Vedran, while others spoke of rebuilding, of finding a new path that did not repeat the mistakes of the past. Humanity, scarred by war yet unbroken, urged unity. They reminded the galaxy that the apex had once begun as liberators themselves before becoming tyrants, and that if the same hatred grew unchecked, history would only repeat. Their words carried weight, for everyone knew the humans had suffered greatly, and yet did not seek to rule as the apex had. They sought balance, a galaxy where no one species could claim to be above the others. It was not easy. Old grudges surfaced, species long divided argued fiercely, and distrust lingered in every chamber, but in the shadow of war, the dream of peace began to take root. Slowly a council was formed, not of conquerors but of equals, a gathering of voices where humanity sat not as masters but as partners. Meanwhile, the ruins of the apex worlds told another story. Vast cities built on arrogance lay broken, their towers shattered, their skies scarred by battle. The survivors of the Vedran wandered their fallen empire in silence, their once proud arrogance reduced to ashes. Some still clung to their pride, dreaming of revenge, but most understood the truth: the age of the apex was gone forever. In many places, former slaves now stood above their old masters, but instead of slaughter, many chose mercy, inspired by the example of humanity. It was strange for the galaxy to see the once unstoppable predators now humbled, surviving only because those they had oppressed chose to show restraint. It was a reminder that power could change hands, but character was what shaped the future. For humanity, peace was not simple either. Their worlds bore deep scars. Cities had been burned, colonies lost, families torn apart. The cost of victory was measured not only in broken fleets but in broken hearts. Yet through that pain, there was also pride. Memorials rose on every human world, not only for humans but for all who had fought and died in the Great War. The names of alien allies stood alongside human names, carved into stone and metal, a promise that their sacrifice would not be forgotten. It was this spirit that bound the new galaxy together. Humanity's strength had never been in power alone but in unity, in the ability to bring others together even in the darkest of times. That spirit became the foundation of the new age. Trade routes reopened, ships that once carried weapons now carried food and medicine, and worlds that had been silent under the apex roared with life once more. The galaxy was far from perfect, and dangers still lurked in the shadows, but compared to the darkness of the past, it was a dawn filled with hope. In quiet moments, some wondered if humanity would now become what the apex once were, rising higher until pride consumed them too. But humanity remembered their own history, the wars that had scarred Earth, the struggles that had nearly destroyed them long before they reached the stars. They carried those lessons into the future, knowing that greatness did not come from ruling others but from standing with them. The galaxy had been changed forever, not by the strongest claws or the sharpest fangs, but by the will of a species that refused to surrender. The new dawn was not perfect, but it was a chance, and in the endless stars, chances were rare and precious. Humanity and their allies had built something fragile yet beautiful, and though the shadows of the apex still lingered, the light of freedom was brighter than it had ever been. And so the galaxy turned a page in its history, no longer ruled by fear but by hope, no longer silenced by tyranny but filled with countless voices, each free to shape their destiny. At the heart of it all, humanity stood, not as overlords but as reminders of what could be achieved when even the smallest refused to bow. The new dawn had come, and with it a promise that no empire, no tyrant, and no predator would ever again hold the galaxy in chains. Centuries passed after the fall of the apex, yet the story of humanity's defiance did not fade. Instead, it became the foundation of a new age across the stars. Children born on distant worlds where once the apex had ruled grew up hearing tales of how a young and fragile species had risen against the strongest predators the galaxy had ever known. In schools and homes, in grand halls and simple camps, the story of humanity was told again and again, not as a legend of conquest but as a lesson of courage. They had not been the most powerful, they had not possessed the greatest weapons, and they had not commanded the largest fleets, but they had carried something greater than all of that: the will to resist and the refusal to surrender. That spirit became the legacy that spread across species and generations. Worlds once enslaved looked to the example of humanity and reminded themselves that no chains could ever truly last. Even the former apex, those who had survived the destruction of their empire, could not escape the shadow of this truth. Once they had been feared as gods of war. Now they were remembered as the tyrants who had fallen before the determination of those they had mocked as weak. Among themselves they whispered of their old glory, but in the wider galaxy they became a warning that arrogance leads only to ruin. Humanity's role did not end with victory, for they too were changed by the war. Their fleets remained strong, but they never sought to rule through fear. Instead, they became guardians, protectors of the fragile peace that they had helped to create. Councils and alliances were built where humans took their place not above others but beside them. Their voice carried weight not because of dominance but because of trust, for everyone remembered that humanity had once fought not only for themselves but for all who had lived under the shadow of the apex. This reputation endured far longer than any empire. Even when centuries turned into millennia, the name of humanity was not spoken with fear but with respect. Across countless worlds statues were raised in their honor, some of steel and stone, others of light and energy, showing not warriors with weapons raised but figures standing tall and unbroken, symbols of resilience. Songs were sung, stories written, and even species that had never met a human face to face knew of their legacy. The idea that one voice, one people, could rise against the impossible became part of the very culture of the galaxy. And yet, humanity did not see themselves as perfect. They remembered the cost of the war, the countless lives lost, the worlds destroyed, the scars that never truly faded. They built monuments not only to victory but to sacrifice, and on those monuments were carved the names of every ally, every fallen soldier, every world that had paid the price of freedom. Their legacy was not only triumph but memory, a reminder that freedom was never free and must always be defended. Generations of humans grew under this lesson, and it shaped them into something the galaxy had never seen before. A species that wielded power but did not hunger for domination, a people that carried strength but used it to lift others instead of crush them. Of course, new threats rose in time. The galaxy was vast, and shadows always returned, but when they did, the question was always the same: what would humanity do? And the answer was always remembered, for the legacy of their defiance against the apex lived in every star. To fight beside humanity meant to fight with hope. To stand against them meant to face the same unbreakable will that had once brought down the rulers of the galaxy. Even the youngest species, newly born to the stars, learned to look at humanity with awe and to whisper among themselves that they were safe so long as the humans stood with them. This was the true legacy, not the fall of the apex alone but the creation of a symbol that could never die. The apex had called themselves the masters of existence, but their reign had ended in ruin. Humanity had never claimed such a title, and yet their example endured far longer than any empire could. Their story became a thread that tied the galaxy together, reminding all species that even in the darkest age, light can rise from the most unexpected place. And so, long after the last soldier of the apex was gone, long after the ruins of their empire had turned to dust, the name of humanity still echoed through the stars. It was carried not only in monuments or stories but in the very way the galaxy lived, in councils of equals, in alliances built on trust, and in the shared belief that no tyrant, no predator, and no empire could ever again enslave the stars. Humanity had proven that strength was not measured in claws or fleets but in the courage to stand when standing seemed impossible. That was the lesson, that was the memory, that was the legacy. And as the galaxy moved forward into new ages and new challenges, one truth never faded. The apex had once ruled the stars, but it was humanity who had given the stars freedom.